You are listening to Humanities Engaged, where we take a closer look at the value of a liberal arts education. I'm Steve McFarland, and I teach philosophy in the Division of Humanities at the University of Minnesota Morris. I'm joined by UMM student and brains of the operation, Adam Kretz. Say hi, Adam.
Hey there, everybody. Thank you for listening. You'll hear me chime in occasionally during the interview with a couple questions, and I'll join Steve afterwards to discuss what we learned.
We are coming to you from the University of Minnesota Morris, made possible with funding from the Mellon Foundation. Please join us as we interview UMM faculty to learn how they teach and why they teach. Today's guest is Dr. Clement Loo, a member of the Environmental Studies Department in the Division of the Social Sciences. Dr. Loo received his Ph.D. from the University of Cincinnati. He often teaches classes such as Environmental Problems and Policy and Theories of Environmental Justice. We bring you now to our interview.
I had not known that philosophy was a thing in high school. I got into philosophy sort of accidentally. So when I first started college, my dream, the way I saw my college path going was into neuroscience, right? I thought I was going to be a neuroscientist, and it wasn't until my last year of my undergrad, my fourth year of undergrad, and I was doing a class that had a lab component, and I spent a lot of time in the lab and had to do my own study, and I was also helping out with some other ones, and it felt like I was in a factory because I was sticking wires into the brains of mice and rats for hours on end each day because I can't remember how many mice I had to run, but there were lots, and in the other studies there were a lot of rats. So I really just felt like a factory worker, just sticking in little electrodes and then running mice and rats through various protocols, and I hated it. I realized the content was fun, but the actual the practice of neuroscience was really boring. So I was stuck thinking I don't want to keep doing this, and this is not the sort of thing that I can do something else with a bachelor's in psychology with an emphasis in neuroscience, right? There's not much need in the private sector for neuroscientists. And so I just thought back to what's a course that I took that I really enjoyed. And in my first year of college, I took Philosophy 101, right? It was just filled with some sort of random elective, and it was actually one of the most fun courses that I'd ever taken. So I took it with Brian Grant, who had a way of poking fun at students that really got me thinking, right? He would always call me adult, right? I would say stuff in class, I was really right. So I was one of those engaged students that always talked, and he'd be like, "No, you're adult, right?" And then one day, he, towards the end of the semester, he's like, "You're adult, but maybe if you tried hard enough and you work with me, one day I can make you into a philosopher." And I, dismissed him. He's like, "I don't want to be a philosopher. Who wants to be a philosopher, right?" I'm going to go to neuroscience. This was a fun time with a fun professor, but whatever. I'm done with this. But when I was in my fourth year, when I was looking at neuroscience and thinking okay, maybe I was wrong about this whole neuroscience thing. What should I do? I thought back to this class, right? It was the ideas were fun. The folks in the class were fun. The way people engaged with scholarship was fun. So I thought, well, okay, maybe I'll give this a try. I'll do a master's in philosophy. I guess it still wasn't really practical because I guess I just never really wanted to be in the private sector. So I thought, let's do a master's in philosophy. We'll see how that goes. And so I did that. I enjoyed it even more. And then, now I find myself here.
So then you got your advanced degrees in philosophy.
Yeah.
But technically speaking, you're in the environmental studies.
No, not neuroscience. Yes, environmental studies.
Yeah.
I don't know why I said neuroscience. So I am. So that actually, it was weird, right? So I think of myself as a philosopher, but even when I was doing my PhD, I was doing interdisciplinary program because at the University of Cincinnati, where I did my PhD, they have an HPS program. Though they don't call it that. They call it the science track or something.
And then HPS means?
History and philosophy science, right? So my classes were interestingly across different fields, right? So half my classes were kind of standard philosophy classes that all PhD students would probably take, right? The core ones. But then all my methods classes were in ecology. I also took some law classes, some policy classes, some design classes, and so it was an interdisciplinary program. So I came out of it not being the most marketable philosopher, but kind of a marketable person in some interdisciplinary field, and so ended up in environmental studies.
And did you go there because you wanted that interdisciplinary education, or did you go there and then find that you enjoyed the?
I went there looking for an interdisciplinary program, thinking that philosophy was best done was interdisciplinary. So I went in there thinking I was going to be just sort of a the traditional sort of philosopher of science, right? But I thought it was important for a philosopher of science to be actually well versed in science, right? Not just kind of know the content that scientists produce, but actually know method. So that was a program when I was looking at it where right, you were required to do PhD level classes in the science, whichever science you worked in. And I thought, well, okay, yeah, like, like I have some neuroscience background, but like what was interesting to me at that point was like sort of with the ecology, biology stuff. So I thought, here's an opportunity for me to get really kind of a solid background in philosophy as well as like the science that I want to work in or work on.
Yeah, and so the UMM is a liberal arts college, and liberal arts college is supposed to be exposed to ideas and then help synthesize them. And then so your background's kind of a natural fit then for liberal arts university.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that came really obvious to me right after I was finishing my PhD. I was looking for that first job. So I before here, I was at Wesleyan, which is another liberal arts college. And I found like when I was looking at the sort of the job ads, like the sort of like interdisciplinarity, thinking about like kind of mixing methods and like theory from a bunch of fields to think about like kind of practical matters. It tended to be liberal arts schools that were looking for folks that were doing that sort of scholarship rather than the sort of very narrow, like you want someone who's just like, is just hard hitting and like philosophy science and just like knows philosophy science really well, which in some, in the sort of the bigger schools, like the old R1 schools, those are
research
one. Yeah, yep. There tends to be the kind of emphasis on that sort of research, right? Departments in those programs tend to look for those really kind of classical scholars versus folks that are just sort of like dabble in a bunch of different areas.
So then let's turn to the classroom then. So how do you convey those kinds of ideas in your classroom? How do you set up if there's a particular class or a type of maneuver you do in lots of classes to get students thinking the way that you want them to be thinking?
I try to get the students to think holistically about problems, right? So I tend to structure my classes sort of similarly no matter what I teach, right? So like I tend to start with teaching the students some basic theory, but I tend to teach theory from across a number of fields, right? So it's never just straight like philosophy, or it's not just straight ecology, or it's not straight political science. It tends to be all three of those in all my classes. So like one of my favorite classes to teach is my climate change and moral responsibility one. So the students spend the first third of that class learning some straight up environmental ethics, right? They go through the progression of environmental ethics from like the early 80s to kind of now, learning people talking about like intrinsic value, talking about like weak anthropocentrism, talking about like pragmatism in the environment, things like that. So they learn that stuff. And then they also learn a little bit of climate science, right? So they learn about sort of the mechanics of climate change. They learn about how climate change will have physical effects in different ecosystems. And they learn a little bit about law, right? So they learn about some of the policy, like sort of the core elements of policy, both nationally and internationally, when it comes to how we deal with climate change. And so that gives them sort of a framework to think about climate change from a range of different angles, because I think the problems associated with climate change are complicated ones, right? Like understanding one facet of it tends to give you an incomplete understanding of the sort of things we need to do to address it. And so they have that foundation as sort of the theory, right? The theory from a bunch of areas. And then I tend to think about what does that mean sort of practically? And so in that specific class, after they spend the first third learning just sort of like the basics of like environmental ethics and like kind of climate science and like some of the law and policy stuff associated with climate, I take them on tours and start like having panels with like various people in the area who are working on sustainability, right? And so like learn about how does it look like in practice? How does it look like when people who might not be thinking about this kind of purely academically, but are in fact trying to do something, what are they doing to try to like deal with climate change or sustainability? And then that gives them some idea of what practically means to deal with these. And then for the final third of the class, I asked them to reflect on both, right? To think about the theory, think about like the actual practice, and think about how those tie in, and then think about, given their sort of theoretical commitments or like their sort of the outcomes they want to achieve, like their objectives, what sorts of things should they be doing to participate in like kind of our communal efforts to deal with climate change? And for most of my classes, it takes that sort of arc, right? Whatever the topic is, they learn about some theory, they learn about some of the practical things people are doing, and then they're asked to think about, well, how does both ways of approaching it come together to let them think about what it is that they should be doing.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if you could offer up a straightforward example of an ethical environmental problem that might be in that first part of the course for students.
So they wouldn't be looking at a specific ethical problem. They would probably be looking about like ethical theories, right? So like they would be doing things like for the particular class I'm talking about, climate change and moral responsibility. The book I've been using is Kathleen Dean Moore's book. It's called Moral Ground, and so the way she has it organized is into like different sections for the reasons, the sort of values that might motivate our concern with the environment. So like, so some of them might be self-interest. So they'll learn about like kind of like moral egoism and how moral egoism might actually be a reason to care about the environment. Namely, right, we need the environment. So if we mess it up, right, it's harmful for us. So just purely out of like kind of self-interest, we should be concerned. But then there's also things like thinking about like generational justice, right? Like, so given that there's disparities in terms of who's causing harm and who's being harmed, namely our generation causing harm or previous generations causing harm, and then who gets harmed are future generations who might not be responsible for the things that we've done. Or I mean, by definition, not responsible for things that we've done because they're not here yet, right? So, and that kind of generates moral duties. Or thinking about sort of just social justice more broadly, right? That the impacts that are being caused by those of us living in sort of the wealthier West, and it's kind of harming folks that are lower income in the global South, right? And thinking about just sort of distributional justice and how addressing that might be a reason to deal with the environment. And then, or like the intrinsic value of nature, that might be another one. If we think that natural entities like ecosystems or like non-human species or non-human individuals have value or are moral subjects, and given that we're causing them harm, right, that might be a motive. So those would be some of the theories that we covered in that class. So that would be the theoretical part. And then the practical part would be like, you know, we have a panel where like someone from like Ingebrigtsen's, like the folks that deal with our trash will be there. Some of the folks from like facilities management might be there. And then they'll talk about how we dispose of waste in the area and the ways that they try to dispose of waste in a more sustainable way. Or like I might bring in like someone from the Rock, some farmers, someone who might be engaged in like sort of low input agriculture, and have them talk about like how they think about like reducing impacts when they're growing food, and then right like panels like that, so they can think, so the students can think about how does it look like to people who are engaged in actually trying to make our systems more sustainable. What are they in fact trying to do, and then what are they doing to try to achieve those objectives? And so that would be right thinking about the practice, and then like. For that final part, an example might be like I'll ask the students to do a reflection letter where I'm asking them to think about like which moral theories do they think are the ones that are most motivational to themselves, and then which are the sort of the practical problems that they think are the most important and why, and then try to put it together to think about what does that mean in terms of how would they discharge what they see as their moral responsibilities given their values.
Yeah, so I like the framework. I sometimes have a critical reflection unit, kind of. It's this tough trade-off because you want to stuff in content all the time, like learn more, learn this other thing, learn this other thing.
Yeah.
But then sometimes it's like a good idea to see if it's really sunk in and how they're evaluating it for themselves, not just us telling them more stuff. So, maybe I should do that more often. It seems like a good strategy.
The reason I started doing that was when I first started teaching, I was often disappointed when I talked to the students after the class about the class and the stuff they remembered, and it was often very few things. And I thought, students can only take away a few core messages. Let's make them think real hard about those core messages. Yeah. And so I've started erring towards less content, more analysis, right? So I just want them to get some kind of key basic things, get them thinking about it, and then like hope they take a second class with me so I can build off of it.
Yeah, so one of the strengths of the liberal arts university is you get exposed to more, but it also means you're less concentrated on some of this. You have your major, which you can do a lot, but for classes that are designed for intro students or something, it might be their only class. So then, of course, they're not going to remember everything, right? They're thinking about their other stuff they have going on, and both in school and outside of school. So then you want them to. You want to still have had an impact, and for them to remember some things. And I always think this too, right? Like, if what I want them to remember is enough that if we started talking about it, they go, "Oh yeah, I remember now."
Yeah,
Might not
yeah.
be the front of their mind, but they would be like, "Oh yes, I do recall."
Yeah,
if,
yeah.
if you're in a conversation or something.
Yeah, so for me, it's more even if they forget all the specific facts
Yeah.
that we covered or like the theories we covered,
Mm-hmm.
I want them to be able to pick up some of the method, right? Some of the capacity for analytical thinking, right? I want them to be able to actually morally reason. Like for example, for like ENST 3112, the climate change moral responsibility, I want the students that, right, when faced with a moral problem, to be able to think about it in the way that, right, like a moral theorist would,
Mm-hmm.
so that they could actually think through what are the think through like what are the sort of the reasons for doing for thinking something's right or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
What are how do we assess what sort of duties we have,
Yeah.
and then think about that practically in terms of discharging those duties, which if Facebook is accurate, I think people can't do often.
I do. I learned all my philosophy off of Facebook. How could you say that? If you could think of one thing you could do to quote unquote fix how this is very general, not calling anybody out.
Sure.
Maybe nobody here even at this school, but how your areas, if you picked up on how some other people teach them,
Right.
or how they approach teaching, even, is there anything that you think, you wish kind of people talked about this more, emphasize this less, or
Right. So, I mean, the difficulty for me is I don't sit in too many people's classes.
Yeah.
But thinking back to my own education,
Mm-hmm.
there were definitely things that I saw that the instructors that taught me did that I wish they had done differently, and that I do try to do differently, which is to think about context, right? So I have a fairly classical, like, philosophical education for most of my career, or my education career, until I was in my PhD. What I did was I read a lot of philosophers talking to other philosophers, right? And so, like, even when I was learning philosophy of science, I rarely read primary texts in science in those classes, right?
Yeah.
I just read philosophers of science, talking to other philosophers of science, really only caring about the philosophy,
Yeah.
right? Like, it was just like really gussied up, like, epistemology. And I think that
Yeah, epistemology is the philosophical study of
of
knowledge. and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, right. I mean, I think there is space for that, right? I mean, I think I'm not trying to say all scholarship needs to be the sort of
Yeah.
scholarship I want, but the problem is, much of the scholarship that happens is that sort of scholarship, right? That sort of where people are thinking about problems outside of context, right? They're thinking about them kind of really abstractly. Particularly, I think, in philosophy and the humanities, when you're doing kind of more empirical studies, you have to be a little, right, you have to consider context a little bit more. But even then, right, you can still focus on very narrow problems and not think about, like, how they connect to other things or what they mean sort of practically for, like, day-to-day life. Which I think is something that's been lost in academia, right? Like, if you look at, like, Plato, and you look at, like, Socrates, and you look at Aristotle, they were very much thinking about, like, what does philosophy mean for living? Plato's dialogues are useful for someone who isn't a philosopher, right? For someone who's just thinking, like, how do I live my life in a way that, like, kind of allows me to live the way I want, right? Thinking about those dialogues would be helpful for them. I'm not sure most scholarship nowadays that are done by professional scholars has any application for most people's daily lives.
Do you think that extends into the classroom too?
Yeah, I think so. That I think that's the problem, right? So,
Mhm.
like, and then we teach that. I shouldn't say we, because I actually think people here do pretty well. Like,
This
not doing
this
that.
is kind of a general vague. I'm not trying to.
Yeah.
pick on
I'm not
anyone.
pointing at specific.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, like, mostly my education and, like, kind of big state schools, right? Like, like, where often I would, right, take class. I'm like, I have no idea why I need to know this, right? I'm only taking the word of the instructor that I need to know this because and so I do think in general, I think those of us who are professional academics need to be thinking when we're teaching about, at least sometimes, tying in what we're teaching with sort of the context of the world more broadly. What does it mean, right? Like, and I think most of the things we teach do mean something, right? Like, even if you're the most, like, theoretical of physicists, right? Like, it's important for something, right? Like, people wouldn't care if it wasn't important for something. We don't just, right? Like, particles are important for something. I don't know what, because I know nothing about it.
I think particles are important. I agree with you about that.
But knowing about particles helps us know about the world in some way, so that makes our lives better somehow.
Yeah.
And I think we do need to think about that.
Professor Loo, I'm a student right now, obviously, and taking a bunch of courses, and I would love to know what kind of advice you have for a current student who is taking maybe your classes or just taking classes in general as a college student to get the most out of their classes, to really get them the most value for their education.
Yeah, so I would think the two things I would suggest, not just to students, anybody, is to read better and to listen better. I tend to think people are not well served by primary and secondary education. So like, I think we learn how to read, well, I shouldn't say we in sort of the Western world, maybe not even Europe, because I don't know how Europeans are educated. We in North America, as in the United States and Canada, are taught to read passively, right? So we're taught that, I think the way we treat text is like a monologue, right? We're listening, we're passively sort of taking in information that like someone who knows better than us is providing us with. We don't think of reading as part of engaging in a dialogue, which I think we should, right? So I find that I have a hard time paying attention to monologues, right? I have a hard time remembering them. I remember the really funny points, or like the really well like express points. Like I like, so if there's a nice turn of phrase, I remember that. But most of it is just sort of like washes through me, right? It's just sort of something that lowers my heart rate and like blood pressure for a bit while I relax. Right. I don't actually remember the content very well because I'm not engaged, right? I'm just kind of there, like just like killing time. But if I think of it as a conversation where, I'm expected to somehow respond, I pay more attention, right? Because I want to be able to respond appropriately. And so I think when I'm engaging in reading, I try to respond as I'm reading. So I have a lot of marginalia. Anything I read, the margins just filled up with like what I would be saying back to the author if I could say something at the moment. And I think students and people kind of more broadly should just do that, should learn to do that. Because then I think they would better remember the things that they're reading, right? Because they're engaged with it as a live conversation, right? We're social animals. We're built to remember our social interactions. So if we treat reading like a social interaction, we'll be more likely to remember it. And then when it comes to like listening, I think we often fail to listen to voices that are different than our own, right? So we tend to be inclined towards listening to things that confirm the things that we already believe. And that narrows, right, sort of the perspectives we have. And I think that narrows the sort of the possibility space we have when we're thinking about things. And so I think it is important to listen to folks who have different views than yours, who have different contexts for those views, who have different perspectives, so that we can get fuller pictures, right? And I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm not saying that we should listen uncritically, right? I think the vast majority of folks are wrong about what they're right about the things that they believe. Yet it's still worthwhile to attend to the people who, even if they are clearly wrong, because there's a reason why they think the things they do, and it might help you think better about the things that you care about, right? Helps you identify the ways you are wrong, and helps you think about considerations that you might not have continenced as being important for the thing you're thinking about.
Just one follow-up there, because
Sure.
I definitely get more out of my readings if I do the marginalia,
Yeah.
and I take a lot of notes and really kind of pour over the text and interact with it. And that also takes a lot more time. At least in my experience. So I'm just wondering for students listening, it's like, wow, that sounds like that's going to take more time. And I've only got so much time allotted. And this reading is 25 pages. If I do it that way, it's probably going to double, triple the amount of time it would have took me otherwise.
I don't know if that's true. So, it'll take a little bit more time, but I think it's the only, right? I think it's actually very similar to like reading and listening are very similar sort of activities, right? So like actually taking time to respond to someone instead of just letting them like kind of, spout off will lead you to have a slightly longer conversation, but I don't think it's that much longer, right? And I think the payoff is so much more, right? So like you save time and not having to read the same thing over and over again, right, to integrate it. So I think in the end it washes out to be pretty close. So like, and I'm not saying you have to write essays, right? I'm just saying like jot down like, oh yeah, like this is a good point. Like I like this about it, or like, nope, you're wrong. Here's why. right. So like my marginalia tends to be like, like 3 to like 5 words. So, like, similar to like when I'm semi-engaged in a conversation, I'm like, okay, could you tell me more about that? Right. Like, oh, so what you're saying is blah. Okay. Or like, no, I think you're wrong about that.
Just something.
Yeah, just something to help you, like, right, like, so that you're just engaging, right? So imagine you're just in a cocktail party or a dinner party or whatever kind of party with someone who just won't shut up and they're going on about something, but you just need to be polite enough to like respond a bit, so you're not just like sitting there nodding at them. Right. That's all you need for the marginalia, and that'll help you remember it better than just like passively nodding your head.
Cool.
Yeah, and your main point is just reading critically, and
Yeah.
marginalia is like one way, right? So
Yeah, just to be engaged.
One thing I do sometimes, I personally am not a huge marginalia writer.
Yeah.
But I will write a précis or a summary.
Yeah.
What's a précis?
Kind of like a summary. So right after I read it, I'll write down, these are the main ideas. This is how they made that move. And then if I want my quick reminder of on what page this happened.
Yeah.
So it's instead of writing a margin on the way, at the end I go, this is the page it was on. I go back and find the same purpose.
Yeah. I sometimes do that as well. Like if I'm reading something really carefully, I'll have the marginalia, then I'll have like at the beginning of it, I'll write my own my summary, like in a similar way that you do, and then put like look at this page for this highlight. Yeah.
And it serves a similar purpose.
Yeah.
You said that you think everyone is wrong in their beliefs.
Yeah, I
almost everyone.
No. So if pushed hard enough, I tend to buy the pessimistic meta induction. Right. I tend to think like if you look at history, we're probably wrong. Right. Like so like.
Yeah. Do you care to spell that out?
Pessimistic meta induction.
Yeah. So
some philosophy
I can't actually remember who's the first
terms.
person who proposed that argument. I don't remember who it is.
I don't recall either.
But it's something like this, right? So an inductive argument is an argument that doesn't kind of guarantee the truth of its conclusion of its premises are true, but increases its probability. And the way the pessimistic meta induction works is if you look at historically and like human scholarship or just sort of like the history of human ideas, most of our past ideas have been proven to be wrong. In fact, right, like in a long enough timeline, it seems like every idea we've ever had in the past has turned out to be wrong, like in some kind of fundamental way, right? Like ideas tend not to last sort of unmodified for more than like a couple hundred years at the most, and most of the time it's more than just a few years. And so if we have been wrong for like all the things that we sort of believed in the past, then this seems plausible to suggest that the things that we believe now are all wrong. And I tend to buy that argument.
And the classic examples are things like we used to think the sun revolves around the earth.
Yeah.
We used to think light was particles, then we thought it's waves, and now we know it's photons.
Well, we think
it's photons.
Right. Like, lightning used to be just Zeus being angry.
Yeah.
I actually had the experience this semester where I was like, it dawned on me in my political philosophy class, we were really getting into various details of political arguments. And I was like, you know what? I don't think there's anything I actually am confident in. I don't think I have any view that I would really be like, yeah, I think this is correct.
Yeah.
And so it was like the final straw. And now you have somebody ask me like, oh, what do you really think is true? I'll be like, I don't know.
Yeah. And no, so I tend to buy the view like Bas von Frassen's view that there's some things that are warrantly assertable, right? I have reasons to say those things. I have reasons to believe them, but do I think that they're like kind of big T true or that I have big K knowledge? No, I wouldn't say that.
It's a difficult philosophical issue.
Yeah.
But your view is like, well, there's reasons to think we have a duty, an epistemic duty, a duty of knowledge, of reasoning, to believe some things. Not just anything is equally plausible.
Yeah. No, so I'm not sort of some weird relativist. Like anything you think is equally warranted. No, I think there are more warranted things. Yeah. And I think we have very good reason to think like certain things are clearly false. But I also think likely the case that we've gotten everything we think now. There's some element of it's probably wrong.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting topic. And it'd be fun to talk about more, but we can't do it. So is that one of the? So then, what is a big question of like content or substance or a theory or a fact that you're hoping students take away from your classes where everybody remembers, something like this? Maybe the pessimistic meta-induction?
No, so so that's something that I don't think my students ought to think that, right? I mean, I'm not even sure that I ought to think that. I just do think that. No, so I mean, I think if there was like sort of content things I do hope that all students get is that number one, I think that perspective matters, and to recognize that when you're thinking about particularly like environmental issues, but I think it's true for a lot of things that are like kind of politically relevant, that one needs to understand that objectives are dictated by values, and people legitimately have different values. And just because someone doesn't agree with you in terms of objectives doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have good reasons for thinking the things they do. They just might not have your reasons. And it's worth understanding those reasons if we want to sort of negotiate part of the political enterprise, which I think we have to, because we live in a society and we need to think about how to do things collectively. No matter like how much of a libertarian you might be, you have to recognize you're living in the context of other folks, and you just can't do whatever you want without thinking about those folks. So I think recognizing perspective matters, recognizing that value matters. I think those are things that I think is important for students to know, my students at least, doing the classes that I'm teaching. Mm-hmm. I also tend to think it's important to recognize that climate change is happening, right? For the context of all my classes, that seems to be, right, that there really are environmental problems, that they're not just some sort of conspiracy by hippies to like smash capitalism, right? I think recognizing that is important.
By that you mean man-made
climate change. Yeah, okay. And that the sort of environmental problems that people are standardly concerned about really are problems, right? They're not just sort of folks who are angry about capitalism.
So if I'm one of those people who's suspicious,
right?
What's your elevator pitch of like what is the facts of what's happening?
So with climate change?
Climate change, yeah.
So the things that we are very certain of are that since the Industrial Revolution, we've been taking carbon that's out of the carbon cycle and returning it to carbon cycle, right? Carbon that has been sort of sequestered as coal or like as fossil fuels, right, like petroleum, which are things that weren't in the atmosphere, weren't in the carbon cycle, we're returning to it, and we've returned a lot of it. We also know since the last 200 years or so that carbon dioxide and a number of other gases tend to trap heat. We also know for sure that average temperatures, atmospheric and kind of marine, are increasing. Right, that's not estimates. We've been taking measurements of like temperature for more than the last 100 years, and we've seen a steady increase starting early last century, right? So like around the middle of, sort of like the early middle last century, we've been seeing that. And then we've seen a really large acceleration of that in the last 20 or 30 years.
And that's globally,
that's globally.
Doesn't matter what your region is.
Yeah, so in some regions, some regions, right, there's variation between regions. Right. But if you average across the globe, there's a distinct increase in temperature. The rate that temperature's been increasing maps very well to the rate that we've been pumping out more CO2 by burning sequestered carbon. Nothing else that might naturally affect our average temperature can account for that, right? So that stuff has been monitored as well, and the sorts of activity that we've witnessed, other than the
solar winds or volcanoes,
all those would not,
mm-hmm.
could not,
mm-hmm.
right? Unless they work completely different from the way we expect, mm-hmm. right? Like if we were like 100% wrong about how all those things work, then maybe, but I don't think we're 100% wrong, right? So even if I buy the pessimistic meta-induction, I don't think we're wrong about everything, right? Like there might be some small details that we've gotten wrong. But, right, so there's no kind of reasonable way to think that it's not us. Yeah, and it matters, right? So you're thinking sort of the amount of change. We've had roughly a degree of change already since pre-industrial, and we're expected to have at least another degree, if not 2 or 3. And if you're thinking what that means in sort of the context of like sort of geologic history, that's actually sort of a big deal, right? So like the difference between pre-industrial to ice age is about 4 degrees. So if you're looking at 3 or 4 degrees more, that's right the same sort of scale from ice age to like the way we should be relative to like where we are now, and that sounds not like a good time. And so like those are things that people should understand, because not understanding those means we're going to be in for a really bad time. And so content-wise. That would
Yeah.
be like sort of my elevator pitch about that one. We should think about that. We should accept it. We might disagree about what we do about it. We might disagree about how important it is, but we should recognize at least that's happening so that we're thinking about it in a reasonable way.
Right. Yeah.
And methodologically, what are some a big idea or two that you think that you want everyone to get out of your classes?
Yeah, so methodologically, I think is to broaden scholarship, right? So I think it's important. Again, I've said this a few times, is to pay attention to perspectives that have historically not been attended to, right? So, like, I think it isn't, so, like, right, thinking about, like, environmental issues, for example, doesn't just mean thinking about, like, what ecologists say, right? It's thinking about what do people in various communities that are, like, vulnerable to, like, the harms of climate change, what do they think, right? Not just listening to, right, folks from, like, NASA and NOAA, right, who know all about climate. We also need to think about the people that, well, if we're asking them to deal with higher sea levels or being displaced by flooding or like deal with collapsing agriculture, it matters what they think and what they want if we're thinking about how to deal with those sort of problems in a way that's effective and just.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we often don't. We tend to pay attention to experts and tend to like not view the lay perspectives as important, right? Particularly in like our field, right? In philosophy, right? So if you read philosophy from like the 50s to like even the early thousands, the aughts, there's always like they're talking about the voc and like the lay in sort of a mildly like insulting way. I think we need to move away from that, right? We need to recognize that yes, expertise is important. We need experts. We need to like understand and listen to experts, but applying what they say requires understanding the needs and perspectives of the average person.
And then finally, what resources can we learn more about these topics we've been talking about? Usually we hope that there's one accessible to everyone and maybe one a bit more advanced for people who have a basic knowledge.
Yeah, like a YouTube channel or a podcast or a blog maybe for the...
Yeah, so I'm bad with the YouTube and podcast and blog.
No problem.
But I do think there's an actual professional academic source that's also very accessible to the average person because he's kind enough to post everything on his website. So like, person who's interested in like environmental stuff and interested in like justice, I would point them towards Kyle Powys White, who's a philosopher at Michigan State University. I think it's one
I
of
think
them.
so.
Yeah, he also has a personal website where he posts everything he writes, and he writes both for like academic publications and for like sort of general popular publications, and he posts all of that onto his website. So if you're interested in these things, I would just point you to look him up and look on his website and find the things on that website that are appropriate for you.
Great. So thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no problem.
Learned a lot.
Well, thank you.
Okay, Adam, what did we learn today?
Yeah, I learned today the value of thinking about particular issues from a variety of different perspectives, and not just the theoretical, but also the practical, and how those two are interwoven. I just thought the way he structured his class really makes the value of that so clear, because there are a lot of different forces and factors at work inside of an issue like climate change, and then that's just one example.
Yeah, it's a neat structure for his courses. It gives me food for thought. I, as a teacher, a lot of times there's so much you could say, and you're thinking about where to cut off stuff that seems relevant to you that you want students to know, but you can't teach them everything that you want them to know. So then you're making sort of choices about, should I talk about this? Should I talk about that? Well, will that take us too far afield? And so on and so forth. Is it applicable as widely as some other stuff? Is it just my pet personal interest or not, So I like that he both has a theoretical, practical, like you say, from multiple perspectives, but he just always includes a significant amount of reflection time, because one thing that some people might do, and I definitely think I've done this, is you keep learning new material all the way to the end. And I think there's some value to that. The new material might be things that people care about and are interested in and should know. But also, I think students can, if they have time to reflect, they might appreciate more what they've learned in the class, if they have a time to see how it connects to their own interests, and then maybe it helps settle in the learning that they actually did already. Whereas if you're pumping out new stuff, maybe the students are learning it, but maybe they're not in the mode of incorporating and really digesting new information at the end of a semester. So it's something for me to really think about.
Yeah, well, maybe could you say something about, what reflection consists of in your view?
Well, I do some reflection tasks in some of my classes, but maybe I should do more, right? So one of the things I do in a class is I have an assignment where they start off early and they write a paper with almost no textual familiarity with the issue. It's just what they walked in the door with. Then we study it as a class. We look at the arguments, counter arguments, and then they write a scholarly, make sure you cite the author and do correctly represent their views and engage with them paper. And then towards the end, they have to write, okay, what's the difference between the first paper when you walked in the door and the second paper when after you've learned a lot, right? And the third paper can kind of maybe help cement their own growth, their own perspective. What did it change or not? And most often, students don't really change their mind about a certain issue, but they almost uniformly say, I have a better understanding of why people agree with me and why people disagreed with me than I did when I walked in the room. And so there's like a kind of value to that kind of cognitive task that doesn't have to be new stimulus from the outside, but a kind of reckoning with what you've already got rattled around in your brain.
Yeah, so your type of reflection, it seems geared towards thinking about how your thoughts have evolved.
Yeah, in that class, yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Which is cool. I like that. But it seems like in Professor Loo's class, maybe there's also this additional component, since it is something like climate change.
Yeah.
There is this additional component of, wow, what am I going to do about this? Am I going to do something about this? Mm-hmm. Did you get that sense that he's hoping that students will think about this in practical terms?
Yeah, so maybe there's a kind of practical reflection about my place in the world and how I should be acting. And there's actually a long tradition of philosophers who think that's the best kind of thinking.
Oh, yeah, could you speak to that?
So all the way from Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, we have this tradition of two kinds of thinking. There's scientific type thinking, but then there's practical thinking, how to live your life. And they don't think there's a particular science to how to live your life. All you can do is sort of try to develop wisdom and a sense of justice and courage, and they call it temperance. It means kind of moderate living, not eating too much, not partying too much, but not doing none of that either, doing some. So the idea is that the best thing you can be doing pretty much is developing your sense of justice and wisdom for how to interact with yourself and others in the world.
That's really interesting in light of his class. And that concludes this episode. Links to the references our guest mentioned can be found in the show notes. Before we go here, a big thank you to the Mellon Foundation and the Humanities Division for supporting this podcast. The views and opinions expressed are solely those of the individuals participating and do not represent the University of Minnesota Morris or the University of Minnesota system. You can find our podcast on iTunes or anywhere you get your podcasts. And if you want to help out the show, please leave us a review on the iTunes store or share the podcast with others. Thanks for listening.
This has been Humanities Engaged.